Hello, good afternoon. I'm going to risk the ire of the French government and take off my mask. Please don't report this. I see I have intimidated everyone so much with this title that they all are waiting outside the door, waiting for me to explain what abstractive divergence is, and then deciding whether or not to come in. Unfortunately, I'm not going to provide them with an immediate explanation. You'll have to wait a few slides, but it will come, I promise. So I'm Christopher from Enoma, and I'm going to be talking about abstractive divergence is an existential risk. What is abstractive divergence, and why is it an existential risk? Hopefully, in a few slides, you will have some idea. Or you might be terrified, but at least you'll have some idea. But first I'm going to start with a story. A story of economic mismediation. So let's say you're getting up in the morning. Maybe you live in New York, maybe you live in Paris. Let's say Paris. And you go to a corner store, you have a little bit of time before you start work, and you want to grab something to eat and a bit of coffee, some caffeine to help jumpstart before you go to your 9-to-5 job. At the corner store, you have some options. We lived in this kind of capitalist economy. You have some nice options to pick from, a little bit of illusion of choice. At the corner store, say, you can choose between 3 kinds of coffee. There's a Brazilian dark roast, there's a Nicaraguan medium roast labeled fair trade, and there's the house special. Of the 3, the dark roast is a bit more expensive, house special and the fair trade seem to be about the same price. And fair trade seems good. I want fair trade. I want people to be treated fairly. Labor conditions important. Okay, so you pick the fair trade coffee, get your cup of coffee. Then you see a few energy bars. There's a hazelnut energy bar, there's a chocolate toffee energy bar, and there's a blueberry energy bar. And the blueberry and chocolate toffee are a little bit cheaper, hazelnut one a little bit more expensive. You want to avoid too much sugar, so you take the blueberry one, glance at the label, hope that the sugar is from the blueberries, not added afterwards. Eat your bar, drink your coffee, and go about your day. Seems simple, right? You got a coffee, you got an energy bar. But involved in this interaction, which to you was just a matter of choosing between options at a corner store, is a whole network of economic interdependency. And it so happens in this case that the reason the fair trade coffee was the same price as the house special was because even though it is fair trade, let's say that the label is accurate, it is fair trade, that the farmers in question are extracting nutrients from the soil, they're monocropping. So because in order to compete, while remaining fair trade, in order to compete with the house special, this coffee producer chose to grow one kind of coffee in the same area of soil for a long time. So they'll only be able to grow for about 5 or 10 years, and then that soil will be exhausted, those nutrients will be exhausted. But fair trade doesn't say anything about that, so you don't know. And they're able to compete on that basis. So in the course of purchasing this coffee, you're in fact contributing to some kind of nutrient extraction from soil, of which there is a finite amount of arable land. It also turns out that the reason the 2 energy bars, the blueberry and toffee energy bars, were cheaper than the other one is that the companies involved found a way to manufacture wrappers for their energy bars in a way that dumps some pollution into the Seine. And the other energy bar was a little bit more expensive because that company chose not to do that, but it's not able to do it as cheaply because it can't just dump its pollution. It has to, say, store it safely. It has to come up with a manufacturing process for its wrappers that doesn't produce so much. So you aimed to buy breakfast, right? You just wanted breakfast and coffee. You didn't want to think too much about it. But in those interactions, you are contributing to the continued existence of those companies and these practices which are not creating a world in which you want to live in. It's contributing to, say, the extraction of nutrients from soil, which will mean that food gets more expensive in the future, or which will mean that the soil can no longer support, say, trees or crops which would capture some carbon, and you're contributing to pollution in someone else's food, or in perhaps even the future water which your children will drink, if it's the Seine and you live in Paris. So what's going on here? You're using money, and you're paying with money, and you're getting something that it seems like immediately is what you want. You wanted the energy bar something to eat, and you wanted the coffee something to drink, a little bit of caffeine. But you're also getting these long-term impacts, which aren't what you want. And if you were to, in fact, sum up the net impacts of all of these interactions, maybe it so happens that as a result of buying stuff, you're actually making your life worse, right? That like the net damage, maybe not just from your contributions, but from everyone's collective contributions and purchases in this fashion, is making your life worse. So if money is, in some sense, representing value, then something has gone very, very wrong, because you are paying with money, you are using money in order to get something, and that which it is what you're getting, not just at the point of purchase, but in total, is, in fact, perhaps a worse quality of life. So something's gone wrong. There's some mistake in this economic system that leads to these kinds of interactions having a result that you really didn't intend. But in order to analyze what this is, I think we need to dive into what money itself is doing and how it is allowing these complex economic supply chains to exist. Because as what we have here is a kind of result about the net effect of all of these complex interactions. But we don't yet know what the contributing components, what are the key causes or the generator functions. So in order to investigate this, I want to dive a little bit into coordination itself, because I'm going to argue that money is just a particular form of coordination, and that it's a form which has some really fundamental flaws. So what is coordination? I take coordination to be very broad. Say a group of hunters in a tribe coordinates with each other in order to encircle a deer, which they want to kill and then eat. And in order to encircle that deer, they need to communicate with each other. These hunters are arranging themselves in some kind of circular position because they want to prevent the deer from escaping, and then they'll narrow their circle inwards until they catch it. So in order to coordinate, they need to use some kind of language. They need to talk with each other, perhaps, or they need to use hand signals. And it's important in this case that the deer doesn't understand, because if the deer understands what they're doing, it can probably run away ahead of time. So there's one case of coordination. Another case of coordination might be some divers, say deep-sea divers who are trying to investigate shipwreck. And those divers need to lift heavy pieces. So they're underwater, maybe they've got their oxygen tanks, they're going down and trying to lift up, this piece of the Titanic that looks like, maybe they're even scavengers, this piece of the Titanic that looks like it has some gold. In order to lift that, they need to work together because it's too heavy for any one of them. So they need to signal to each other, and because they're underwater, they probably can't use language, and they don't have walkie-talkies, so they instead use hand signals. They're coordinating. Another case, perhaps something which some of you have done, could be community members coordinating to build some kind of public good. Let's say people in a town who want to build a new school for their children. And they're coordinating, in this case, in a written fashion. So they're writing down potential lesson plans, they're writing down potential architectural diagrams for this new school. They need to come to agreement because they need to work together to fund the school or to provide the resources required to construct it. In all of these cases, this coordination implies a distinction between what I'm going to call an internal and an external state. So the divers have some internal state, like they have plans as to where they're going to move or where they're going to put their foot next. The hunters have internal state. They have plans as to which direction they're going to walk in or where they're going to shoot the arrow. And the community members have internal state, their preferences as to what kind of school should be built or what should be taught there. In order to coordinate, then, these participants in these mechanisms need to transmit information to each other about their internal states, because what they need to agree upon is some future plan that at least talks about or contains information about what their internal states are going to be. So the hunters need to coordinate so that they can plan out their actions in unison, so that they can go in a coherent inwardly I have no idea how hunters hunt deer. I'm a vegetarian, so I'm just making this up. So they can go in an inwardly circling fashion and encircle the deer. And the community members need to coordinate on the architectural diagrams so they, build a school which fits together instead of having little bits of wall and no protection from the elements. And the divers need to coordinate so that they perform the actions at the same time. Otherwise, one would start lifting the shipwreck and the other would not be there yet, and it would turn over and open up a nest of undersea, lethal octopi. Octopi. Right, so there's an internal and there's an external. These coordination mechanisms are embedded in a situational context. And in all of these cases, there's a particular form, or a particular medium, or a form of language. In the case of the divers, it's the form of hand signals. In the case of hunters, it's the form of, say, spoken language. They're yelling to each other. And in the case of community members, it's written language. This form needs to suit the context at hand. It wouldn't really make sense. The divers obviously couldn't exchange notes to each other underwater, and they can't really speak either. It won't go far enough. And the hunters couldn't really pass notes around while they're trying to encircle this deer. While the community members, were they to try and communicate or coordinate orally in order to build this school, would run into playing a game of telephone. It's quite difficult to agree on precise properties of architectural diagrams when all you can do is state numbers and try to remember what that translates to. So the form needs to suit the context. But also in each of these contexts, there's some sort of shared goal, or there's some sort of potential benefit shared by all the people or all the participants who are coordinating. So the hunters want to work together because only in virtue of working together will they be able to encircle this deer, capture it, then eat it, and split the venison. The divers want to work together because maybe they have some prior agreement to split the proceeds of this treasure wreck. And the community members want to work together to build the school because they all have children who they want to be educated there. So there's some kind of shared mutual benefit which only can be realized through this kind of coordination. Right, so I argue that money is another kind of coordination mechanism, but money is a kind of coordination mechanism which has some particular rules. And other kinds of coordination mechanisms also have rules. Say language has some rules of grammar, they're vague. Sometimes, though, there are institutions or agents which exert varying degrees of control over the enforcement of the rules of the mechanism itself. So, and I'm going to butcher the French, but an example here with language is l'Académie Française, which tries to sometimes come up with new words in French to discourage, I suppose, young French people from using hashtag. As far as I know, they have not done so successfully, but here's an example with language of some body politic trying to control the rules of the coordination mechanism itself. With money, this is a little more obvious. There are central banks and governments which have direct policy control over the rules of money, can mint it, etc. When there is a locus of control, when there is an entity who is controlling the enforcement of the coordination mechanism, if the participants who want to use that mechanism don't themselves have control over it or are located elsewhere, be that geographically or commercially in some kind of a space of mutual influence, there's a fundamental possibility of divergence. A concrete case of this happening is in, say, communities in South America using the US dollar because they don't have access to a stable currency. But of course, the monetary policy of the US dollar is controlled by the central bank in the United States, which has frankly little knowledge of and certainly doesn't care much about whether or not the policies they choose are in the best interests of or even not harmful to the users of the US dollar in South America. So when considering coordination mechanisms, and in particular when trying to design one, as we're going to do throughout this talk, we need to think about whether, if there is a locus of control, if there are rules which need to be enforced, is that aligned with the participants of the coordination mechanism itself. Now let's talk a little bit about money. I argue that money is a mechanism for coordination. And to demonstrate this, I'm first going to give a really simple example. In particular, money is a mechanism of coordination for the exchange of physical goods. So let's say that we have Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Alice, Bob, and Charlie live in a small community, and they engage in various kinds of farming practices, which I also don't know anything about, I freely admit, so the examples are a little bit hypothetical. Let's say that Alice has some chickens, and Alice produces eggs. And Bob has some cows, Bob produces milk, and Charlie grows wheat and produces bread. And Alice would like some milk to go with her eggs. Bob would like some some bread to go with his milk. And Charlie would like some eggs to go with his bread. Why they want this for breakfast, I don't know. But it is a plausible, at least, example. However, since none of them have bidirectional matching desires and offers, they can't trade directly. Alice can't trade with Bob, Bob can't trade with Charlie, Charlie can't trade with Alice. So there's a potential like shared gain, right? If in fact we could realize a situation where Alice gets some, whatever it was, Alice gets some milk, Bob gets some bread, and Charlie gets some eggs, they would all be happier, even if they traded a little bit of their own resources for it. But without a mechanism, that isn't realized. So if we introduce money into this scenario, then Alice, Bob, and Charlie can buy and sell the goods which they have and which they want. So Alice can sell her eggs, Bob can sell his milk, and Charlie can sell his bread, while Alice can buy milk, Bob can buy bread, and Charlie can buy eggs. And if they price the goods which they're buying and selling at something like that which they value them at, then the market will clear and everyone will become slightly happier off in this particular case of physical goods for breakfast. So here, money is serving as a coordination mechanism. It's transmitting information about what people want. And the mechanism and the sort of enforcement of money, or the tie between the exchange of money and the exchange of physical goods, allows for the realization of this preferred state for all involved. But money as a mechanism has some pretty fundamental limitations. So one of the limitations, even in these simple scenarios, is that money can only express linear or independently related, independent preferences. If I prefer, I can only price single goods, right, without some more complex system of contract. I can price the eggs, I can price the bread, I can price the milk, maybe there's cheese. But if it's more valuable to me to have a grilled cheese sandwich than the price of bread and cheese, those are not independent variables. They're actually dependent on whether I can get both at once. But I can't express this just with prices, right? So there's a pretty fundamental limitation. But the other limitation of money comes into play when we're talking about more complex supply chains. So to go back to my earlier example, when you buy coffee, or when you buy an energy bar, or when you, good heavens, when you buy a cell phone, those purchases, at the end, you're sort of a consumer at the end of the supply line, and those purchases include interactions with, say, a network of hundreds or potentially tens of thousands for a cell phone, different suppliers. And at each layer of the supply chain, there are some suppliers who are, say, competing with each other to manufacture memory, or to manufacture grow blueberries, or to produce some kind of component for the thing which you're buying. However, even though those components may have a lot of variation, certainly the production practices can vary, the actual impact which those producers have upon the world with their actions can vary a lot. You only see maybe some limited specification or some nutrient facts label on the energy bar into price. So that's a reduction in information. You care about the total impact. You care about the world in which you live, and you care about the net, I guess, causal influence which this interaction has on that world, but you only see when you purchase something the price. So there's a kind of dimensionality reduction. Furthermore, when you combine that dimensionality reduction with competition at each stage of the supply line, you run into what's called a multipolar trap. A multipolar trap is where there are several suppliers, say, who are competing to produce something which is roughly fungible. So they're competing to produce rubber for a tennis shoe, or they're competing to grow blueberries for an energy bar, or they're competing to produce coffee for a cappuccino. Most of the reason for choice, say, in the scenario is decided by price. So mostly people are going to buy the cheaper coffee if the quality is roughly the same. Mostly they're going to buy the cheaper tennis shoe if the quality of rubber is roughly the same, right? But then these companies have choices. Because of this dimensionality reduction, the price is not capturing everything that's going on. And wherever these companies have a choice between some kind of production practice which externalizes some harm, so which dumps pollutants into the river, or which chops down trees from the Amazon, or which exploits local labor, or which even just like extracts local resources in some kind of unsustainable way, if employing that production practice allows them to manufacture product more cheaply, they will be able to outcompete all the other companies who don't do that. So if there are 5 rubber manufacturers, even if most of them are nice guys, even if 4 out of the 5, aren't going to cut down the Amazon just to make cheaper rubber, because they say, oh, that's awful. We won't do that. If one of them is willing to defect, if one of them is willing to start using that production practice, they will end up with rubber that's, even 1, 2, 3% cheaper, and they will outcompete the other companies and probably drive them out of business. So in your engagements with a complex supply chain where there is this kind of dimensionality reduction and competition at each step, you are contributing to this kind of, this is what I call then abstractive divergence, this kind of chaining process by which the factors of natural selection are selecting for behavior in which companies or producers externalize as much harm as possible. Because whatever harm they can externalize without it being reflected in price or in factors that affect your choice, the better they will be able to outcompete each other, and the longer they will continue to survive in this competitive capitalist system. So this is the kind of explanatory, explanatory mechanism which I think we need to address this scenario. We need to take a look at this kind of dimensionality reduction which is happening in each stage, since this is causing the divergence. And we need to say, can we construct a mechanism which allows for the realization of this coordination which people actually want. So you want to buy energy bars and you want to buy coffee without this kind of divergence at each step from, say, your long-term preferences. So there's information here that's getting lost, and we need to find some way to factor that information so that as someone who's interacting with this complex supply chain, you can start to factor these variables. But here we went into a very, very tricky dilemma relating to time. All dilemmas relate to time. And that is, computational reductionism is useful. If I go to the store in order to buy coffee, and I want complete information about everything which is in this coffee, I'm going to need to read like a 600-page binder that goes over all the production practices, and I need to know about soil ecology, and I need to know about the local geopolitical history of the region, and I need to understand potential labor tensions, and I need to understand even the shipping infrastructure responsible for getting my coffee from Nicaragua to France. If every time I want to buy coffee, I have to read this very long 600-page binder, I'm not going to buy any coffee, or much more likely, I'm going to give up and go to the other store, which doesn't require that I read this binder, and just pay $2 for my coffee and go to work, right? So the very reductionism, which is this computational reductionism, the reduction to a price, which is so damaging, which is an essential component of this abstractive divergence, is also critically useful because people have finite amounts of time. So we need some way to have our cake and eat it too. Or we need some way to allow the participants in these mechanisms who are engaging in commercial transactions with complex supply chains to factor all of these variables which they care about while not needing to do it by hand every time. To me, that implies that we need some way to hide this computation, or we need some way to outsource it, such that users can articulate preferences that factor everything, or at least that factor enough, that factor these impacts which they care about, but mostly, in most of their interactions in everyday living, that preference enforcement kind of happens behind the scenes. It's not something that they need to think about or read a long binder every time they want to make a purchase. Because of this divergence, then I argue that we have three options. So the essential divergence here, to touch back to it, this abstractive divergence, is a result of the combination of the dimensionality reduction of money, competition, and really long complex supply chains. So we have three options. One thing we could do is go back to living in tribes. To be honest, I don't think it's a bad option. I mean, it's probably better than nuclear weapons and nation states, right? Like, there's a lot of diversity in tribes. I mean, you could grow a lot of mushrooms, you could wander through the forest, you wouldn't have to deal with cellular data connections or taxes so much. Not a bad option. But we'd have to give up friends who live all across the world, we'd have to give up some of these cool technologies, we'd have to give up, I don't know, electronic music, we'd have to give up spaceships. Perhaps we want a way to keep these things, but still, it's an option. Another option is that we keep going on our current trajectory, and as in each stage of the supply chain where this kind of multipolar trap happens, we're continuing to externalize harms. The harms will eventually accumulate, and the carrying capacity of the Earth is finite, so that risk is existential. If we keep going along this way, humanity will, in its current form, end. Not necessarily go extinct, but the sort of global commercial interplay would end, whether due to catastrophic conflict or simply uninhabitable locations, or both at once. It remains to be seen, but that would be option two. The third option, and perhaps the most optimistic option, is that we come up with some other mechanism. So we find a way to get what it is that we want out of money, namely this kind of coordination across really wide networks of people who are engaging in various kinds of economic transactions or exchange of physical goods, without this dimensionality reduction, while somehow solving this computational reductionist dilemma. So, there are actually two questions here, and it's important to understand that they're distinct in this design of a potential coordination mechanism. The first question is whether this exists at all. Is there a stable equilibrium where, say, 7 billion people can coordinate, where they can engage in complex economic transactions with something that doesn't have this kind of abstractive divergence, doesn't have this problem that money has. Even if the answer to that question is yes, it's not enough. Because the second question is whether we can get there from here. Most coordination mechanisms have some kind of network effect, because you're using the coordination mechanism in order to work with other people, other participants. You know, the US dollar or the euro is valuable in some sense, insofar as you can use it to get stuff you want, in virtue of, mostly, being used by a lot of other people. And if, in order to start using some new mechanism, you have to immediately completely give up the old mechanism, it's not going to be very appealing. No one will be able to do it. And whoever could do it would not be able to compete in some sense with the existing system for participants. So we need to answer two questions. Does a better equilibrium exist? And can we get there? Is there some kind of path in the mechanism design trajectory space, which is upwards, or it's like mostly upwards? Maybe there's some little windy parts, but it's acceptable. Some ideological backing plus not too much of a sort of reduction in physical resources or in comfort or something like that. Does that exist? Now I want to talk a little bit about what this kind of mechanism needs to look like. So what are we doing with money when we're engaging in these transactions? Well, the first thing we're doing is that we're expressing our preferences. We express preferences by making purchases. When you buy something, that's transmitting information up the supply line to whoever's producing stuff about the fact that people want this thing. And the way in which money is spent sort of means that information is accurate, because the action of buying something requires that you spend money, so you can't fake it, or so to speak. So that's transmitting information about what you want. Then we also need some way for all of these, we need some way for people to find each other who want to potentially trade. We need some way to computationally, I guess, well, not only communicate information about preferences, but also settle the actual transactions. So when money has some kind of rule set, right? It has some kind of, you can only spend funds which you have, and you have to conserve supply. And we need to find some way to, whatever this hypothetical mechanism is, where something like it's less clear in something like language, but it still exists, right? Like the state of language is in our minds, and it's not exactly, language doesn't have an exact state. We don't have exact consensus on it, but most of us in the room probably speak English. Some of us, me excluded, probably speak French, and one can say that English or French as a set of rules and a set of meanings is some fuzzy sum of all of the states in the minds of the people who speak the language, right? French is not what's written down in the dictionary, nor is English. It's the language is that which people speak. In the case of an economic mechanism, we need a little more precision, and especially in this case where we want to more accurately reflect preferences, we need computational precision. I argue that the way that we can address this computational reductionist problem is to have preferences be computational. Instead of people just choosing to purchase or not to purchase something, we need to be able to write down as a program what it is that we care about, so that when we're engaging in these economic transactions, because we can't think about this every day, when we're engaging in these economic transactions, we can engage in those in a way which conveys our more complex preferences about the world, while the computation to figure out whether those preferences are actually being realized by the transactions in which we're engaging is outsourced. So it's outsourced to some kind of computational system, which will end up being a blockchain, go figure, that does most of the heavy lifting for us, while still allowing us to choose. This needs to be transparent. You need to be able to, transparent in terms of rule set at least, you need to be able to see what it is that's going on, and you need to be able to change your preferences, but most of the time you don't want to be privy to all of the exact details. I argue that the system also needs to be private, and my argument for privacy, or for privacy of interaction, is going to be a little bit different, or perhaps a little bit more abstract. In the current system of, say, monetary commerce and coordination, there are a lot of asymmetries, or like you could treat this. You could say wealth inequality represents at least a form of this, but there are cases where some people would benefit from keeping the existing system as it is. And without privacy, this argument is quite general. It doesn't even depend on this particular case. You could have another case of trying to switch coordination mechanisms, in which this would also apply. Without privacy, those who start to use the coordination mechanism can be specifically targeted. So what we want to protect here is this, if I go back a few slides, just one slide, is this second question. We want to protect the feasible path from where we are at the moment to where we want to get. And in order for that path to be feasible, those who start using the new coordination system, which might otherwise be targeted because they might represent, say, a threat to the dominant position of those at the top of some hierarchy in the current system, without privacy, they could easily be targeted. So privacy protects this kind of nascent emergence of some alternative equilibrium. So I went, boy, how many minutes? 25 minutes through this talk, and I've not yet said the word blockchain except once in saying that I was going to say the word blockchain. Now I'm going to say the word blockchain, except that I don't even like that word because it's just a data structure. I like the word distributed ledger. So I work on Enoma, which is a distributed ledger and a set of associated protocols, which, as you might have guessed, aims to provide an alternative coordination mechanism as a sort of part, at least, of the third approach, as I outlined earlier, of finding another form of coordination that doesn't have the same problems that money does, so we can continue to engage in something like these current networks of global commerce, which we like, without externalizing harms repeatedly. What is Enoma? So Enoma is, first and foremost, a system for digital preference expression. Users using Enoma can write what are called validity predicates, which are a little like smart contracts in that they're programmable, but they're designed to express the kinds of state changes that the user wants or that the user prefers. So as a user of Enoma, I encode my preferences, you could say, in a validity predicate. And the exact mechanism with which I can do that can vary, in part because my preferences are going to change in time, and sometimes they're going to change very rapidly. Sometimes they're going to change very slowly. I probably don't want carbon to be emitted. That's a very slow changing preference. Maybe I want an energy bar now, and I don't want one an hour from now. That's a very fast changing preference. So some of this preference expression will be done by sending transactions to a ledger. Some of it will be done by signing things. But either way, validity predicates allow users of Enoma to express computationally that which it is what they want. The ledger itself then provides a kind of settlement system which settles state changes as long as everyone involved is happy with a new state. So if we go back to our earlier example of Alice, Bob, and Charlie with, eggs, milk, and bread, then Alice, Bob, and Charlie would write validity predicates that express that they have eggs, milk, or bread, and they want eggs, milk, or bread. No money is required here, and no explicit coordination between Alice, Bob, or Charlie is required here. They just need to write down which states they would prefer, right? So there's a way of representing eggs, milk, and bread on the ledger, and Alice, Bob, and Charlie say that they would prefer a situation in which they had slightly fewer eggs and slightly more milk, something like this. And if there exists a state which is better, which is like Pareto efficiently better, then the ledger allows that state to be changed. So all these validity predicates return yes, Alice, Bob, and Charlie accept the change, and that state change is enacted as soon as they do. But first, in order to, especially for more complex trades, in order to even figure out what they should be talking about or what kinds of state changes are possible, these counterparties need to find each other. So the other thing which this, and it's not just money that does this, it's money enmeshed in a whole superstructure of legal contract and of commerce and advertisements and lots of good and not so good things. But Alice, Bob, and Charlie need to find each other and say, were they trading not physical goods, in which case they probably have some kind of local connection, but rather digital goods or something more abstract, they need to discover each other. So in order to facilitate this, Enoma has what we call an intent gossip system, where users craft pieces of data that express what it is they want and what it is they have, what kind of trades they're willing to execute, and they send those around. So unlike transaction gossip, which aims to gossip all the transactions to everyone, this is like a sparse gossip network. So users are writing down their intents, and they're sending it around to anyone who might potentially be interested in being a counterparty. Those intents then are assembled by entities we call matchmakers into transactions. So if I am paying attention to what Alice and Bob and Charlie are telling me, I might see that in fact I can create a transaction which sends eggs, milk, and bread around appropriately, and then I can use those intents, which are binding because they contain digital signatures. I can use those intents to craft that transaction, and I can settle it against the ledger. So this is how we facilitate counterparty discovery. Earlier, I talked about how we want these interactions to be private, in part so that participants in this new coordination mechanism can't be asymmetrically targeted. In order to allow these interactions to be private, Enoma uses zero-knowledge proofs. And the basic conceptual way in which I think it makes sense to think about zero-knowledge proofs is that the ledger simply verifies adherence to the rule set. It doesn't need to know anything about content. So the content, and here, the content of something like, as Adrian mentioned in his talk, the content of something like messages versus metadata is fairly obvious, where in financial transactions it might be a little bit blurry, but when I say content here, I mean all of the details of the actual transaction. So that which the ledger verifies is just like the rule set. In the case of money, it's something like, was supply conserved? In the case of, say, trading eggs, milk, and bread, it's like, did in fact, Alice, Bob, and Charlie approve the state transition? But the contents of that state transition, even the assets like eggs, milk, and bread, and which went to whom, those are all private to the ledger. This is also important because, in a sense, the ledger is something that is far away from the actual commercial transaction occurring, especially if the commercial transaction is local, as an exchange of eggs, milk, and bread between 3 people in the same town. So we want to send as little information far away as possible. Shelling binding. So one question someone might have is, okay, so let's say this ledger enforces these rules, and let's say people can write down preferences that say that they don't want carbon costs to be externalized, they don't want pollution to be dumped into the water, whatever. What prevents me from just, ignoring it? What if I, say, lie about this? Or what if I just choose to use another system specifically when I want to engage in these kinds of transactions? Or specifically when I'm a producer in part of the supply chain? The answer to this question is a little bit tricky because we also don't want to create, we don't want to create too much binding, right? I mean, the system of legal contracts and money uses force as the binding mechanism. So if you don't pay for a ticket on the subway, or you don't follow the rules of capitalism, you can be eventually put in jail. There are several steps in between, but ultimately force is what backs it up. If we can avoid it, I think we should. We don't necessarily, I would argue, need that kind of, because force also comes with risk, and like armies and nuclear weapons and essential accumulations of power, and generally bad stuff. So we would like a binding mechanism that doesn't require that much oomph. I think we can get this because participation in the economic system itself is valuable to people. So what we want to do is tie. So if I want to participate, think of it as like playing a game. So when I play a game of chess, sit down with my friend Alberto, and we play a game of chess. And we start moving pieces on the board, and I'm losing, and I really hate losing at chess, right? So Alberto and I have exchanged queens. And I take my queen, and I put it back on the board. And then we keep playing, and I win the game. Why Alberto lets me keep playing, I don't know. If I win a game of chess, I think the answer is no. Because the moment I change the rules, the moment I put the queen back on the board, I'm really not playing the same game anymore. This is the kind of binding that we can get with distributed ledgers. As soon as I change the rules, I'm no longer in consensus with everyone else. I'm no longer participating in this system. And I argue that that's enough. That if we have producers and consumers who want to participate in some economic network together choose to use the system, and in virtue of doing so, they have to agree to these rules, to say internalize carbon costs as people have expressed their preferences. They can always choose to use some other system, but then they would no longer be able to interact with these other participants. Just like I can always choose to speak some other language, but then I'm no longer going to be able to communicate with people who speak the language that I don't want to speak anymore. Of course, in order to actually influence these real-world transactions, we need to get data about the world into and out of the ledger. Just as if you have some kind of language, which is only written down as a set of arbitrary symbols, without connections to the world as it acquires, say, in people's minds for natural language, that language doesn't really refer to anything. It is meaningless, you could say. Similarly, we need ways for the ledger, or the preferences expressed upon the ledger, the assets or physical goods represented on the ledger, to acquire meaning in the real world. And we need this in two directions. The first direction is usually what's termed as the oracle problem. So we need to get data about the world, about, say, the carbon that producers are emitting, or about even the supply chains themselves, the structure of the supply chains themselves, onto the ledger. The best way to do this is to embed, say, the commercial structure of who's paying whom in this complex supply chain directly by having the ledger be like that which they use to settle it, because then it's hard to fake. And for stuff like oracle reporting of pollution, perhaps you need some kind of, you still may need some kind of trusted party, you need some kind of shelling point game, like commit, reveal, reporting. You need some way of getting that information onto the ledger. The second direction, I haven't heard another name for it, so I've been calling it the actuation problem. But if there exists an existing term, I'm always trying to avoid unnecessary terms, so please let me know. The actuation problem is the problem of getting data about the ledger into the real world. Mostly, this just consists of people choosing to treat state on the ledger as representing something. And every time you accept payment, so if I accept payment, or I accept a state transition to the ledger as reason to give someone else my physical eggs, or if we're still using money, if I accept payment and give someone coffee, that is actuation in the sense that I'm talking about, because the state change on the ledger is affecting the world. But you could think of a more direct version of this, albeit one that should be treated with great caution, where there's some kind of like robots which fly around, or which run like clients for the ledger and which enforce the rules, or which are, you know, scanning stuff or something like this, or where there are, say, gates at a border, which are maybe they're taking maybe there's some kind of NFT for a proof of COVID vaccination, and these gates at the border want to verify that you have you've received this vaccination, while you want to protect your own privacy. So you could create a zero knowledge proof that you own an NFT, which proves that you received a vaccination with, you know, this particular vaccine, blah, 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 and present that to the gate at the ledger, and it would check that state, it would check the state on the blockchain, maybe check some other proof of your identity, something, and allow you through. So that's also a case of actuation. But in all of the instances where we want, and what we want, you know, we're not trying to, you can build a ledger or a language, you can invent a language as some kind of academic exercise in designing something interesting, which is cool, but in order to have this affect the real world, in order to perhaps alleviate this abstractive divergence, we need semantic embodiment. So we need, in all of these cases where we want data about the world to affect the ledger and data on the ledger to affect the world, to figure out a way to craft an oracle to get the data onto the ledger and craft some kind of actuation to get the data into the world. Finally, I want to go back to, or penultimately, I want to go back to an earlier point where I talked about alignment of control. So in this utilization of a distributed ledger to enact this kind of preference expression and settlement, we're making a sort of slight approximation here. The consensus mechanism, say in BFT consensus or Nakamoto consensus, can fail. And even if we try to build a resilient system, say if there's some kind of proof of stake token, there are technical requirements of the system, right? And if enough participants choose to, for whatever reason, not follow the canonical rules, whatever those might be, they can cause the system to do something else. In my view, that means that it's very important that we have a kind of out-of-band incentive alignment, that the participants, the validators, or the people who are even matchmaking transactions, or the people who are in some way enforcing the rule set of the system, even if it's decentralized, it's important that they also have a stake in the future of the community itself, so that they're also members of this group which is trying to build a school, that they're also farmers in this community which wants to trade. Because only if they have this other out-of-band incentive are they going to, want this system to, continue to operate in the best interest of this community. And as soon as it's controlled somewhere else, we have the same problem that I talked about with the US dollar, having the bank in the US and users in South America, where as soon as there's a divergence in the best interest of those groups, the ones controlling the rules may do something else, which causes the coordination mechanism to no longer work, as the participants who wanted to use it aim to use it. Enoma is part of a whole. In order to get to a better equilibrium in this design space, we don't just need like a distributed ledger. We need a bunch of experiments, I would argue. And we need, in particular, we need a carefully crafted transition. Because we exist as part of this system of monetary interaction. I mean, all of us, we paid money for this conference. We probably bought some lunch. Certainly the conference organizers bought us lunch, right? So there's another layer of interaction. We are, even in building these systems now, we are in part sustained by, our existence is sustained by this monetary system of economic coordination whose abstractive divergence we want to alleviate. So we need to craft some kind of path that does not immediately require that we, say, give up using money, while also allowing us to actually explore and test whether this alternative equilibrium exists. And that will require not just blockchain protocols, especially not just blockchain protocols deployed in contexts where the people who are using them, could also just use money and would continue to live just fine, but also local experiments. We need, and by local, I don't just mean geographical. I also mean, say, local and commercial space. A game could start using this, for example, instead of money. And in many cases, those kinds of experiments may be more self-contained or maybe easier to test them in isolation. Because we want to answer, again, two questions. We want to answer the question of whether this better equilibrium exists and what a mechanism for it would look like as we're trying to design. And then we need to figure out some way to get there from here. But if we can do this, then we have our cake and eat it too. If we can craft this kind of alternative mechanism, then hopefully we can continue to come to Paris and meet people from all around the world who I would have never been able to meet if I lived 100 years ago, and continue to play with computers and continue to occasionally launch rockets and make electronic music and to do lots of fun things, which depend on even the current flawed global supply chains, but they depend on that depth of complexity and specialization, and often, in some cases, genuine freedom. If we want to retain that, we need to find a way to alleviate this abstractive divergence. And I think the only trajectory I see, and Enoma is not the unique solution to this, it just tries to be a solution to this. The only trajectory I see which allows us to do that is one in which we design this kind of alternative coordination mechanism. So I think this is the question we should be interested in as architects of protocols. Can we design this? What does it look like? How do we get there? Thank you. Any questions?
How does fractal scaling work?
Yes, how does fractal scaling work? So in fractal scaling, users can launch Enoma instances for their local, I should have explained this better, good question. Users can launch Enoma instances for their local communities, be those geographically local or commercially local, as in some kind of game. And those local instances are controlled by the communities. So they're not, it's sovereign. Maybe there's some kind of proof of stake token for your community, or just some set of people who are responsible for operating the blockchain. But all of the transactions which you're interested in settling amongst members of that community then settle on that local instance. And you can have an intent gossip instance for your local community. When you want to interact across fractal instances using Enoma, you can use interchain protocols to send assets and even sometimes to settle trades atomically when you need to. So just as the nature, the content or the nature of commerce itself is fractal, that there are more interactions within local communities. If you live in Paris, most of your transactions are with people who live in Paris. We think it makes sense to scale the protocols, both from the perspective of latency and the sort of alignment of control, which I talked about, by having local instances which settle most of the transactions between members of community and occasional cross-instance transactions when you need to trade with someone far away.
This system sounds very complicated and expensive to run. So it's kind of it sounds like it has adverse effect on liquidity for most things, and the expression of preferences in private forms, not in private, but private especially, it sounds like it's computationally hard and probably slow as well. So that's not a question per se, because I don't know how to formulate it, but it sounds like a lot of obstacles. What you can do there to make it work?
That's a good question. I think there are two parts to that question, and it's important to distinguish between them. One part is, what is the cost, sort of technically, like what's the computational cost of doing all of this stuff? The good part about that question is that the computational cost of doing all this stuff goes down as our computers get faster. And although human population continues to increase, it does not increase anywhere near as rapidly. So in some sense, the complexity of the coordination problem is growing, but it's growing slowly. And the speed of the hardware to which we're outsourcing this computation, and say the cost of storage or something, well, the inverse of the cost of storage, that is growing still quite fast, or even maybe low exponentially. So there's reason to think that even if zero-knowledge proofs are slow now, they will get much faster in 5 years, and we don't need to, we're not going to need to, in a global sense, settle that many more transactions. The second part of this question is this expensive in time? In order to express their preferences accurately, are people going to have to spend a lot of time describing them, interacting with the system, thinking about it? And if the answer to that question is yes, then it won't work either. Because, just like the 600-page binder, maybe it's a little different, maybe it's working in code, but if I need to spend all of my time thinking about these transactions, I can't go about my everyday living. So here it's very important that the components of preferences, of validity predicates, are themselves redistributable, just like open source code. And that it's important that, say, they are aligned with existing networks of trust. So maybe I have some friend who spends a lot of time researching environmental impacts. What I really want to do is mostly delegate my preferences about environmental impacts as I'm engaging in complex economic interactions to this friend, right? And we want to be able to do that in chains. So this is why I said Enoma as part of a whole. We'll also need infrastructure for sharing preferences between people and delegating sort of this kind of computational crafting, or delegating the creation of programs which capture the kinds of preferences which people have in ways which align with expertise. But I think if we can do that, the good news is that all of these components are sort of open source, fungible, because we're using zero-knowledge proofs. You can share like circuits or something without sharing the actual data. There's reason to believe that we can craft some kind of system that will make that relatively inexpensive in time, so that most of the time I don't need to think about it. I just need to check every year or something and readjust my dials and talk to my friends just as I would normally do. And when they make some suggestion, occasionally I go home and change the settings on an app on my phone to incorporate it.
Thanks, that was a really interesting talk. You're talking about this as being an existential risk, and given the example you're talking about, monocropping, things related to, the destruction of the planet, that sort of, first it's a big problem, and second it puts a timeline on how much time we have to, one, build the problem, but then two, and this is where I was curious to get your perspective, is we need to onboard as many people to participate in this system as possible. And I always sort of think about these sort of things from the perspective of, like, what would my mum do? And my mum's, like, kind of just got onto WhatsApp, she's sort of proper boomer type person. So at Enoma or any of the other projects you're trying to do to solve the problem of abstractive divergence, do you have like a timeline? And are you sort of also thinking about translating all these, quite, very valid but complicated concepts in a way that makes it easy for mass adoption to happen before we screw the planet up?
Well, that's the problem we're working on solving now, right? You should join us. I think part of our approach is to try and release. Part of this relates also to fractal scaling, that we want to release software that people can start to use in their local communities, and that will allow, frankly, the benefits, like maybe the commercial surplus or something generated, to accrue to their local communities, not to accrue to us, even though we're going to launch an instance of Enoma. But part of it, I would say, is very dependent on broader societal awareness, of which Enoma is only a part. But I think the broader societal awareness needs to be very focused on a, frankly, dismantlement of the illusion that states are going to solve these problems, because they're not. nation states, even something like the Paris Climate Accords, are operating with the wrong abstractions. The Paris Climate Accord, if you look at the legal theory behind the Paris Climate Accords, the lawyers are reasoning about how to make things fair between nation states. But as soon as they do this, as soon as, even if you go through something like, okay, there have been different historical emissions of pollution relating to levels of development, maybe we should compensate for that in our sort of the emissions caps we apply to countries, something. As soon as you do that, you immediately run into huge like incentive or game-theoretic problems, because if you try to apply emissions caps differently, then okay, industries are going to migrate between countries, right? This is happening because the layer of abstraction is too coarse. That if you deal with trying to create fairness between countries or enforce these things between countries or rely on some kind of hierarchy to enforce this within the country, while people are moving between countries, it's never going to solve the problem, even if the nation-state apparatus moved faster. So we need to solve this problem at the level of the actual supply chains, which is the level of our everyday interactions, which means that in some sense it needs to be kind of ubiquitous, but also in the background. So I think broader societal awareness, benefits accruing to local communities, and also some kind of wake-up call, maybe, or sense that this problem is. I mean, we still have some time. The good news is that the technology parts of the stack don't take a very long time to deploy. So if you look at apps, which and most apps don't change the nature of commerce. They're not getting rid of money, but apps can spread very quickly. Still, if we want to change the trajectory of, say, carbon emissions, if we don't operate on a timeline of years, it's not going to do very much. So yeah, it's urgent. Other questions? We don't have time. Oh, okay. No worries. Thank you.